Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History of AI podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Adele Reinhartz. And today we're going to be discussing her contribution to Chris Keefe and Jim Crossley's book, The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus. The title of her contribution is Beyond the Jewish Jesus Debate. And with that being said, Adele, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's really a pleasure.
And to start us off, can you tell us what you think the next quest for the historical Jesus should examine?
Well, I think the next quest should focus more on what it actually meant to be a Jew in the first century and how Jesus might have fit into that spectrum of what we know about first century Judaism. There has been a tendency to see Jesus as a unique figure, even though we all now acknowledge that Jesus was Jewish. There are still attempts to figure out how he might have stood out from his Jewish context and how he might have been involved in various controversies with Jewish groups. But I think that there is much to be gained by thinking more deeply as to how he might have actually fit into and been a part of regular Jewish life, whatever that looked like in the first few decades of the first century.
And I just want to remind everybody real quick, but the link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment just below that. I also have the link to it in the chat. So when many scholars look at the historical Jesus and they try to reconstruct the historical Jesus, there's this tendency to try to, in a sense, weed out, specifically isolate the Jewish elements of Jesus and say, okay, all the Jewish elements of Jesus must be historical. And so my question in relation to that is, how does one attempt to, and could it be problematic in attempting to reconstruct the historical Jesus by reconstructing only his Jewish aspects of him and then phasing everything out as simply being embellishments?
It's very hard to know what's embellishment and what is history. And to some extent, the ways in which different scholars will approach that has to do with what they think about the Gospels as historical sources to begin with. And so there are maximalists who consider many aspects of the Gospels to be historical as opposed to embellishments or fabrications even. And then there are others who are quite minimalist, I'm in that latter category, who don't really want to pronounce on what's historical and what isn't beyond a few very basic points. The other thing that would affect how scholars approach this question has to do with what they want to achieve. So if your main point is to emphasize that Jesus was Jewish, then you will ignore other things and you will tend to look at the passages where Jesus is portrayed as doing Jewish things as historical, and you'll place much less emphasis on some of the other passages. If, on the other hand, your main agenda or your main concern is to highlight how Jesus was unique, how he stood out from his background, then you'll engage in the opposite kind of a move by downplaying the elements that show him doing Jewish things and play up the elements that might show him in conflict with Jewish authorities or as doing things that exemplify the claim that Jesus is the Son of God. So the way in which we tell these stories or the way in which we construct the historical Jesus will have a lot to do with our general stance towards the Gospels as historical sources and towards what we actually want to achieve or what we're aiming at when we're telling the story. And some of that will have to do with our faith perspective as well.
We have a super chat question from Solar Knight. Thank you for your super chat. First century ripe with messianic expectations, many charismatic leaders making it plausible Jesus type coalesce, fostering imperial cult myth writers. I'm not sure I understand that
I'm
question.
not sure I understand the question either, but I'll pull out the things that I do understand.
Sure.
So we know from other sources that there were other people for whom messianic claims were made. Josephus tells us about a few of those. That gathered a following around them. And for the most part, according to Josephus, these movements were quashed by Rome, or they just fizzled out. Another part of the question had to do with imperial myths. Well, it's certainly possible that some of the claims made about emperors and kings, for example, that they were demigods or semi-divine figures, it's possible that the gospel writers were alluding to some of those ideas and attributing them to Jesus as well. So that's certainly possible. I don't think we can account for the stories about Jesus entirely on that basis, but it's certainly possible. And I think it is helpful, especially with regard to the other messianic groups. It's helpful to think about the fact that there were other groups around. And I'm not suggesting that they were in competition with one another at all, but there was this tendency at that time for people to follow one or another person as a messianic leader, as somebody, but usually in political terms. And I think it's interesting to think about Jesus in those terms as well, that he also had a following like that. And for various reasons, his movement stuck, whereas some of the other movements, or none of the other movements did. And that, I think, is down to his followers that managed to kind of craft whatever faith or whatever it is that they believed about him during his lifetime, to kind of shape that into a belief system that could be perpetuated after his death.
What are the 6 points do you think that we are on solid ground when it comes to historical Jesus?
Okay, I happened to list those in the article. Luckily, I reminded myself of that. And let me just see if I can find them. Yes, okay. So these are my 6 points. That he was born in the Galilee. I know that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke have him born in Bethlehem. But I think it's quite plausible that he was actually born in the Galilee. The reference to Bethlehem, it seems to me, comes about as theologically, as a way of trying to support the claim that Jesus was a descendant of King David. The second point is that he was born sometime right before or right after what we call the turn of the eras. We don't know exactly when he was born. Many scholars think that the birth date was something like 4 BCE. I mean, we tend to count our present era, the common era, beginning from 0, with the birth of Jesus, but probably it occurred around then, but not exactly then. The third is that he was baptized with John. And here, some of the points that I'm making, including this one, I make on the basis of the criterion of embarrassment. In other words, these are points that are not likely to have been made up because they have to be explained. And so all of the Gospels, they don't all portray the actual baptism, but they all relate a story that refers to Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. And they try to account for that. Because if Jesus, as Christians, ancient Christians believed, he was free of sin and came to free others from sin, why did he need to be baptized? Why did he need to go through a kind of a transformational ritual at the hands of somebody else? And so this makes me inclined to think, me and many others, that this is historical. The fourth point, he gathered a following. I think that's really solid fact. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Christianity. We wouldn't have the Gospels. If it weren't for if he didn't have a following, Christianity wouldn't exist today. The fifth is that he was crucified on the order of Pontius Pilate, who was the governor of Judea at that time, the Roman governor. Again, this is a criterion of embarrassment. It's something that wouldn't have been expected of a messianic figure, and the Gospels try to account for it in various ways. So it seems likely that it is historical. And then the last one, I would say last but not least, is the fact that he was Jewish. And we know this from, well, again, I am giving credence to the Gospel references to Jesus doing Jewish things. I don't think they would have made it up. Now, I'm not saying that the individual references to individual acts are necessarily historical or occurred the way that they are described, but I wouldn't see any basis really for questioning Jesus' Jewish identity. So those are my 6 points.
Does the Gospel of Mark seem to suggest that Jesus was from Galilee?
Well, the Gospel of Mark doesn't have an infancy narrative, so it doesn't really present us with any claims that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and it associates him very strongly with the Galilee and with activity in Nazareth and the vicinity around Nazareth. I mean, all the Gospels actually do have that association. But as I said before, Matthew and Luke create us or tell a story that situates the birth in Bethlehem. But I think it's quite likely that Mark is correct in this, and in having his sphere of activity in the area of Nazareth.
What do you make of Barbara Fearing's argument that Jesus is an Essene and Chaim Maccabee's argument that Jesus is a Pharisee?
Okay. I don't see any evidence that Jesus was an Essene. There was a kind of excitement throughout the period that the Dead Sea Scrolls were being published. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, and they were published gradually over the several decades that followed. And as they were published and translated into various languages, including English, people were really struck by some of the similarities in language and in a kind of conceptual world that we find between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospels. And that led some scholars like Barbara Fearing to argue that Jesus was an Essene and came from that community. I don't see any evidence for that, really. We don't have anything really to tie Jesus specifically to that community. I think some people argue that John the Baptist was actually a member of that community, and because Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, that would have made him a member of that community as well. But I don't see how we can support that. It's pure speculation. Chaim Maccabee and others, he's not alone, but Maccabee certainly expressed this point of view, argued that Jesus was a Pharisee. And on the one hand, we might think that that's a ridiculous argument, because the Gospels actually portray Jesus as being engaging in controversial discussions, sometimes quite acrimonious ones, with Pharisees. So first of all, we don't know if those are historically factual or not, but we also should be careful not to construe vigorous argument and controversy as a separation. In other words, Jesus could very well have been a Pharisee and argued against other Pharisees. That would not have been an unusual thing to do. The reason that we think he might have been a Pharisee is that some of the rulings associated with him, including the ruling on divorce, which is probably the most solid ruling that we have that we could possibly trace back to Jesus, his rulings are similar to what we find in later rabbinic sources associated with Pharisees. So there are lots of red flags here. First of all, we really shouldn't be using later sources such as the Mishnah or the Talmud as background to a first century individual or a first century text. So that's something that might be problematic. That is problematic. On the other hand, it's interesting to think about the similarities. So when it comes to the issue of divorce, the Gospels and also at least the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as well as Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, say that Jesus did not permit divorce except on the basis of adultery. And this reflects an opinion associated with a Pharisaic leader named Shammai, or at least with his disciples, according to the Mishnah. So if he has a ruling that is the same as a ruling of a Pharisaic leader, that makes it possible that he also was a Pharisee. But we really can't say with certainty. We really don't know, because we don't have the full spectrum. We don't know the full spectrum of opinion on these matters in the first century by any means. And it's the same with the Sabbath stories. Many of the stories that in the Gospels that portray Pharisees or other Jewish leaders criticizing Jesus for doing certain things on the Sabbath. These stories reflect, I think, differences in how Sabbath observance was understood in the first century. Not everybody understood Sabbath observance in the same way. We tend to think of Sabbath observance now as something that's laid out, by within an Orthodox community as, not traveling, not harvesting, not doing all kinds of other things. But we don't know whether there was uniformity, and it's really likely that there wasn't uniformity on the understanding of what it meant to keep the Sabbath during the first century. So we can construct a hypothesis that Jesus might have been a Pharisee more easily than we can, I think, support a hypothesis that Jesus was an Essene. But it doesn't mean that either of these, that Jesus was actually a Pharisee. We don't really have the data to allow us to establish that with any certainty.
Solar Knight, thank you for another super chat. Who was a Hebrew Yeshua? I don't understand that question.
I don't understand the question either. Jesus, the name Jesus in Hebrew-speaking Christian circles, he's called Yeshua. But that is a form of the Hebrew name Yehoshua, which is Joshua. So there were many individuals who had that name. It seems to have been a very common name, just as it is now. Oh, now we say Josh, right? That's a diminutive of Joshua. So in ancient times also, they had diminutives and nicknames and so on. And that's the Hebrew for the name Jesus. That's really all it is.
What do you make of the healing stories that we see in the Synoptics and in John?
What do you mean? What do I make of them? Do I think they're historical? Do I think they're miracles?
In the context of how it presents Jesus as special, if not unique.
Okay, well, I think those stories are intended to do that. So in the Gospels, we actually have a kind of a tension. On the one hand, they do present Jesus as Jewish. On the other hand, they also are trying to present Jesus as unique. and to try to kind of explain why a movement grew up around him, and why people should follow him, or why they did follow him, perhaps. And the healing stories are part of that, to show that, the other piece of that is the desire to support the claim that Jesus was the Son of God. And so he's portrayed in the Gospels as doing things that are associated with the divine, and the healing stories are part of that. So part of an argument about Jesus' uniqueness and his relationship to God. Again, there were other people in the ancient world to whom healing stories were attributed. We have stories in the Hebrew Bible as well around Elijah and Elisha that were portrayed as having the ability to heal. So that becomes a kind of a trope to show that a person is special, has a unique relationship to God, has certain divine powers given to him in order to achieve a certain goal of healing another person. So I think that's what that is about.
Do Paul's letters in the Gospels attempt to portray a universal Jesus?
Well, I think they attempt to portray Jesus as having universal significance. I no longer see you.
I'm here.
But you're there. Okay, great. Yeah, I think they do. Especially we find this especially at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, for example, where this is after Jesus has been resurrected. He instructs the disciples to go and, preach to all the nations. And that implies the universal reach of this belief system. And of course, Paul's whole mission was to bring this message of, faith in Jesus and Jesus as the Messiah to Gentiles, that is, to the non-Jewish population of the Roman Empire. That was his goal. And so so we see in the Gospels in general, and in throughout the New Testament, including the letters of Paul, the understanding that this is a universal message. It doesn't just remain within a Jewish context, which is the context within which Jesus operated, but needs to be brought to everybody. And that's the source also of Christian self-understanding as a missionary religion.
How do the Gospels portray Jesus differently? Or let me rephrase the question. Do they portray Jesus differently or consistently when they have him interacting with Gentiles?
Well, Jesus in the Gospels doesn't interact with a lot of Gentiles. There are some healing stories that have him healing Gentiles. So in the Gospel of John, in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John, there's a story in which Jesus heals a man's son from a distance. A man comes to Jesus and asks him to heal his son, to come with him to go heal his son. But Jesus heals him from a distance, and it's generally thought that man was a Gentile. In Mark, we have the story of the Syrophoenician woman. This is Mark chapter 7, where so a Syrophoenician woman would be a Gentile woman who asks Jesus to heal her child, and Jesus kind of brushes her off at the beginning. But then she tells him that even the dogs under the table can eat the crumbs that are dropped by the children. And so he's impressed by that, and he heals her child. So there are a few stories like that. But on the whole, Jesus is presented as interacting primarily with Jews, either with Jewish crowds that he's preaching to, or telling his stories to, or that are present when he's healing, or Jewish leadership, the Pharisees, for example, that he argues with. So there are not that many interactions with Gentiles.
What is the structure of the Passion narrative?
So the Passion narrative, the term Passion narrative refers to the last part of the story in the Gospels, from Jesus' betrayal, when Judas betrays Jesus by pointing him out to the soldiers, until the time of his crucifixion. So that whole sequence is called the Passion. The four Gospels tell that sequence somewhat differently. The details are different, but the overall structure is the same. So you have the betrayal, the arrest, you have some trial scenes before Jewish authorities, and then the trial before Pilate. Then you have Pilate pronouncing the death sentence. You have Jesus being abused and perhaps tortured by Roman soldiers. And then you have the crucifixion and Jesus' death. So that's the overall structure. And it's a structure that, but as I said, some of the details differ. So the things that Pilate says, for example, are not the same in each gospel. Even the things that Jesus says while he's standing on the cross are not exactly the same. So that suggests to most scholars that the story circulated and was embellished in different ways by different groups or individuals. But the overall structure is similar. So maybe the structure is similar because things really happen that way. That's very possible. But we also have to consider that you can't really tell the story with a different structure. He had to somehow, as a Galilean preacher, he had to somehow come to the attention of Roman authorities and be sentenced to death. So you have to tell the story. You can't have him sentenced to death before he comes to the attention of the authorities. So there's a logical structure to the entire story. And the way that the story is told in the different Gospels also has to account for the kind of strange idea that somebody who's wandering around the Galilee and healing individuals and telling stories would somehow be so threatening to the Romans that they would need to crucify him. And so you have to account for that. And one of the ways that the Gospels accounts for that is by putting the Jewish authorities in the middle. They say, well, he wasn't such a direct threat to Rome. He was actually a threat to the Jewish authorities. They reported him to Rome, and events carried on as they did. So the structure is required. As soon as if we believe that the crucifixion was historical, then, and that Jesus was a Galilean preacher, then you have to create a story that allows you to get from point A to point B, from his activity in the Galilee to his crucifixion. And there's a logic to that.
How is John 4:9 seen as an exception to the pattern of John's gospel regarding the Judaioi, when it comes to Jesus identified as a Jew by the Samaritan woman?
Okay. So in the Gospel of John, you have a recurrence of the Greek term Judaios, or usually Judaioi in the plural. That term in Greek occurs more often in John than I think in all the rest of the New Testament put together. So what's interesting, at least interesting to me, is that aside from that one passage, chapter 4, verse 9, the term Judaios is never applied to Jesus by anybody. He doesn't use it for himself. and others don't call him that, except for the Samaritan woman in John 4:9. So I think it's important to point this out, because although John does describe Jesus as doing Jewish things, maybe more so than some of the other Gospels, at the same time, he doesn't apply the normal Greek word for Jew to Jesus, except in 4:9. And so in 4:9, you have a story where Jesus is traveling, and he rests by a well in Samaria. A Samaritan woman comes to draw water, and they have a conversation. He asks her for a drink, and she's really surprised because, as the narrator points out, Jews don't normally share vessels with Samaritans. And so she says, how is it, or how come you, a Judaios, are asking a drink of me, because I'm a Samaritan, and a Samaritan woman at that? So I argue that her calling him that doesn't really disrupt the pattern that I've seen everywhere else, which is that the term Judaios is not used for Jesus. She's referring to him as a Jew because she perceives him as a Jew, and he is, by birth and by ethnicity and in every other way, he's a Jew. But for the Gospel of John in general, the term Judaios, for the most part, is a negative term. It's a term that is used for the most part to describe Jesus' enemies. So because John uses Judaios in that negative and hostile way, he can't apply it to Jesus, because obviously Jesus is not his own enemy. He also doesn't apply it ever to the disciples. So he doesn't use the term Judaios or Judaioi in the plural to describe Jesus or his disciples. And that's because he wants to make it really clear that it is the term to be used for Jesus' enemies. So this is what I call the rhetorical use of the term. So the Samaritan woman is applying the common sense use of the term because she recognizes Jesus as somebody who's Jewish. But for the gospel writer, it's a rhetorical term referring to Jesus' enemies.
What do you make of Jesus being identified as the King of the Jews?
Identified by Pilate, you mean, as King of the
Yes.
Jews? Yeah. So this occurs in the Passion story, where Pilate has, well, first of all, this is in the Gospel of John, where Pilate has a conversation with Jesus about whether Jesus is a king. And this hints at the possibility that the charges against Jesus were actually political, having to do with various claims made for him about being a king or having a kingdom. The other Gospels also talk about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven that Jesus will usher in. So Jesus in the Gospel of John says, well, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, then my disciples, my followers would be fighting back against all of this. But it's not of this world. And so he denies in the Gospel of John that he has political aspirations to overthrow Rome. But Pilate, I think, doesn't really buy it. And so, he, according to the story, he creates a sign that that is put on top of the cross. It's called the titulus, that proclaims Jesus as being King of the Jews. So some people have suggested, well, because of this titulus, it means somehow that Jesus was seen as a king in that same, in some sort of earthly or political sense. And there are hints in the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John as well that was the case. But so I don't know what else to say about that, other than that it hints at the possible political context of the charges against Jesus from a Roman perspective. But again, we don't know.
What do you make of the Gospels, possibly loosening, or if they had loosened up Jesus's connections with Jewishness, and you mentioned Cyril of Alexandria's commentary on John 7. You then mentioned Ernest Renan in
Renan.
context of that. Yeah.
Well, Ernst Renan, he wrote a Life of Jesus, and and other works that talk about the origins of Christianity. He was writing in the latter decade or so of the 19th century. So he was someone who argued that it was Jesus who broke with Judaism. This is part of a larger discussion around Christian origins. And in the 19th and much of the 20th century as well, the discussion around Christian origins focused on what we now call the parting of the ways, that Christianity couldn't really become its own thing until it had separated from Judaism. So the question was, when did that happen and how did that happen? And for Renan, it happened in the time of Jesus and was initiated by Jesus himself. So he doesn't deny that Jesus was born Jewish. It's actually very hard to deny that, even though Nazi interpreters tried to do so. But anyway, Renan was not trying to argue that Jesus wasn't born Jewish. Jesus was born Jewish. But for Renan, Jesus himself, as he began his mission, was very strongly repulsed by certain Jewish practices, especially the sacrificial cult, the sacrifices taking place in the temple. And Jesus, in Renan's view, was strongly opposed to the priesthood that controlled the sacrificial cult in the temple. So he argued that it was Jesus himself who broke away from Judaism and who turned towards the Gentiles and away from Jews in order to promote his message. Now, there's no evidence for that at all. It comes from a certain reading of the Gospels, but it comes even more strongly, I think. It's really shaped by Renan's own views about Jews and Judaism. Renan himself, I think, was repulsed by the sacrificial cult, or the idea of it in the ancient world. And he wanted to situate the origins of Christianity as a religion as early as possible. And that means with the time of, with Jesus in his own time. But this is Renan talking, not history talking.
What do you think are the three main factors that have caused some to try to disassociate Jesus from his Jewishness? Okay. What are the three ambivalents? What are the three main factors of this ambivalence?
Okay, so the first, we've already talked about it a bit, is the belief in Jesus' uniqueness, the fact that he had to be unique. Otherwise, you couldn't really account for the growth of Christianity. And his uniqueness was seen in his Messianic role and in the claim that he was the Son of God. There could only be one of those. And so if Jesus was unique, that takes the emphasis away from the specific family into which he was born. So he would take away the emphasis on his Jewishness. The second factor that historians take into account is the broadening of the Jesus movement to the Gentiles. So this has to do really with where we see ambivalence about Jesus' Jewishness in the Gospels themselves. The Gospels, I think, are already aware. They are aware that the movement spread to Gentiles. In the New Testament, in the canonical order in which we have our documents. We begin with the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then we move on to the letters of Paul. But historically speaking, the letters of Paul were written after the Gospels were written. The Gospels were written after the letters of Paul. The letters of Paul are the earliest documents that we have about the Jesus movement. And so the letters of Paul already document a move into towards Gentile Christianity. That means a move of the Christian mission into the Gentile community. So the Gospels were aware of this, and I think it's possible may have participated in this move as well. And so if the Jesus movement was becoming primarily Gentile, that also loosens the ties of the historical Jesus to Judaism as the story is told. And then the third factor is the one that I've already mentioned as well, and that is the narrative, what I call the narrative imperative, that the story itself requires certain things. So if Jesus, as I say in the article, if Jesus was a Jew like other first century Jews, in what way can he be said to be unique? If he belongs squarely in a Jewish milieu, how can we account for the outreach to the Gentiles? And if he was just a normal Jew, how do we account for the fact that he died or was executed through a Roman form of execution, which was crucifixion? So all of those factors affect how his Jewishness is described in the Gospels. And they create a bit of a tension with the details in the Gospels that do situate Jesus firmly within a Jewish context.
And for my final question.
Okay.
What do you think for the, let me rephrase. What do you think the next step for the next quest for the historical Jesus should be?
That's a good question. I think we started with that question as well. For historical Jesus research, as I mentioned at the outset, I think we need to look more seriously at the overall Roman context of both Judaism and Christianity, Judaism and the Jesus movement. We tend to talk about Christian origins in terms of Judaism versus Christianity, or Christianity developing from Judaism, or Jesus' Jewishness then being broadened out by his followers to a more universal movement. And all of those things, have some plausibility to them. But both Jesus and Judaism and everybody else at that time, they were situated within a Roman context and in interaction with Roman ideas and Roman social factors. So I think it would be helpful to have more of a focus on that Roman context. And of course, that work is being done. People haven't ignored that altogether. But I think that we could do more with that in an attempt to kind of flesh out the historical Jesus, both in terms of his Jewishness, but also how that Jewishness functioned within the broader Roman context. I don't think that we have the evidence to really provide a more detailed account of the historical Jesus than has already been attempted by dozens and dozens of scholars. We just don't have the evidence about him specifically. But what we can do is think about how, what we might know, or how we can delve more deeply into the lives of Jews in the Roman Empire in the first century. And that might allow us to bring the historical Jesus, to flesh him out a bit more than we've been able to do until now.
And before we close, I'd like to remind everybody that the link to purchase the next quest for the historical Jesus will be in the description below, and it will be in the pinned comment as well. And with that being said, Adele, thank you very much for joining me today.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to speak with you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.